The afternoon of March 10, 1945, Winston Churchill stood in the map room beneath Whitehall, reading a decoded intelligence summary that had just arrived from Washington. The paper detailed something that would have been inconceivable to military planners just 3 years earlier. American bombers, enormous four-engine machines, had flown 1,500 miles across open ocean, dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo in a single night, and returned home without a single escorting fighter. The Prime Minister reportedly set down the document, removed his reading glasses, and said to an aide, "The Americans have written the final chapter of air warfare, and it is written in fire." That statement, recorded in the diary of Churchill's private secretary, captured a moment when the theoretical promise of strategic bombing debated in staff, colleges, and argued over in Parliament throughout the 1930s collided with an operational reality so overwhelming it bordered on the apocalyptic. But the journey to that moment, and what it revealed about the nature of industrial warfare, began not with fire over Tokyo, but with a crisis of capability in the deserts of the American Southwest. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In 1939, the United States Army Air Corps faced a fundamental problem. It possessed neither the doctrine nor the machines to fight an enemy 3,000 miles away. American bombers of that era, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, represented marvels of engineering, but their combat radius barely exceeded 800 miles. For a war in Europe, operating from British bases, this proved adequate. For a war in the Pacific, where the distance from the Mariana Islands to Tokyo measured 1,500 miles, it represented an insurmountable barrier. The solution emerged not from military planners, but from Boeing engineers in Seattle, who in 1940 began designing an aircraft unlike anything attempted before. The B-29 Superfortress would cruise at 35,000 feet high enough to escape most anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighters. It would carry a bomb load of 20,000 pounds across a combat radius of 1,600 miles. It would be pressurized, allowing crews to operate without cumbersome oxygen equipment. And it would bristle with defensive armament, 12 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all remotely controlled from centralized fire control stations. But the B-29's most radical feature was invisible. Its Wright R-3300 Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower through a system so complex that early test pilots called them the most temperamental power plants ever mounted on an American aircraft. These engines had a documented ages, tendency to overheat, catch fire, and fail catastrophically during takeoff, the most dangerous phase of flight, when a fully loaded bomber carried 7,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and 10 tons of ordnance. The first prototype crashed in February 1943, killing Boeing's chief test pilot and 10 engineers. The accident investigation revealed fundamental flaws in the engine cooling system. Yet the Army Air Forces, facing pressure from Washington to demonstrate capability against Japan, ordered the aircraft into production before these problems were resolved. By December 1943, Boeing's Renton plant was manufacturing 3 B-29s per day, each one incorporating modifications to address defects discovered in previous aircraft. Crews began calling it the $3 billion gamble, the total program cost at that point. The gamble extended beyond engineering. It encompassed an entire theory of warfare that had been developing in military academies since the 1920s. That strategic bombing could destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war without the need for costly ground invasions. The theory held that modern industrial nations depended on concentrated urban production centers, and that destroying these centers would collapse the enemy's economy faster and cheaper than traditional military operations. This doctrine, championed by Air Corps officers who had witnessed the stalemate of trench warfare, promised a form of warfare that was brutal but swift, trading the prolonged agony of ground combat for the concentrated shock of aerial bombardment. But the doctrine contained an unexamined assumption that precision was possible. American bombing strategy in Europe had been built on daylight raids using the Norden bomb site, a sophisticated analog computer that supposedly allowed bombardiers to drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality proved different. Analysis of bombing photography from 1943 and 1944 revealed that, in combat conditions, only about 20% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of their aiming point. Weather, smoke, enemy action, and simple human error made precision bombing more aspiration than achievement. This gap between theory and reality created a crisis for the B-29 program. The aircraft had been designed as a precision weapon for daylight operations at high altitude. But by the time the first operational B-29s arrived in the Mariana Islands in October 1944, the strategic situation demanded immediate results. The invasion of the Philippines was underway. American casualties in the Pacific Theater had exceeded 100,000. And the Japanese home islands, heavily defended by anti-aircraft batteries and fighter interceptors, had proven nearly impervious to the small-scale raids launched from China earlier that year. The man tasked with resolving this crisis was Major General Curtis LeMay, appointed commander of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. LeMay, then 38 years old, had built his reputation over Germany by developing formation tactics that reduced bomber losses while increasing bombing accuracy. He was known for two qualities: a willingness to analyze operational data without sentiment, and a capacity to make decisions that subordinated every other consideration to mission effectiveness. LeMay arrived in the Marianas to find an organization producing minimal results at maximum cost. High-altitude precision raids against Japanese aircraft factories had destroyed less than 10% of Japan's industrial capacity, while suffering B-29 loss rates of 5% per mission, unsustainable in any extended campaign. The problems were interconnected. At 35,000 feet, the jet stream over Japan created winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, making accurate bombing impossible. The right engines, already temperamental, failed frequently when pushed to maximum power during the long climb to bombing altitude. And Japanese fighters, though technically inferior to American designs, had learned to exploit the B-29's blind spots during these predictable high-altitude approaches. LeMay spent 3 weeks analyzing mission reports, studying reconnaissance photographs, and interviewing returning crews. His conclusion, documented in a memo to General Arnold, dated February 22, 1945, was stark. Current tactics are ineffective and unsustainable. Recommend immediate tactical revision to low-altitude area incendiary attack. The recommendation represented a complete inversion of American bombing doctrine. Instead of precision strikes at 35,000 feet, LeMay proposed attacks at 5,000 to 8,000 feet low enough for accurate bombing, but within range of even light anti-aircraft weapons. Instead of high-explosive bombs aimed at specific factories, he proposed incendiaries scattered across entire urban districts. And most controversially, he proposed removing most defensive armament from the B-29s to carry additional bombs, betting that nighttime attacks at low altitude would encounter fewer fighters than daylight raids at high altitude. The proposal horrified many officers at 21st Bomber Command headquarters. It meant exposing crews to intense anti-aircraft fire. It meant abandoning the precision bombing doctrine that had justified the entire strategic air campaign. And it meant accepting that the targets would be urban areas, where military production occurred alongside civilian, housing a reality that American bombing doctrine had carefully avoided acknowledging. But LeMay had data that supported his reasoning. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese industry operated on a fundamentally different model than American or European factories. Approximately 40% of military production occurred in small workshops dispersed throughout residential neighborhoods, cottage industries, producing components that were assembled in larger facilities. Precision strikes against major factories might destroy assembly capability, but they left the feeder industries untouched. An area attack with incendiaries, by contrast, would destroy both the workshops and the larger facilities, while simultaneously disrupting the labor force and transportation networks that sustained production. There was another factor, rarely discussed in official reports, but present in the operational calculus: Japanese urban areas were uniquely vulnerable to fire. Reconnaissance photographs showed that residential districts consisted primarily of wooden structures with paper walls built closely together along narrow streets. A British study of the Hamburg firestorm in July 1943 had demonstrated that under the right conditions, scattered incendiary bombs could create self-sustaining fires that generated winds exceeding hurricane force, literally turning entire neighborhoods into furnaces. Intelligence analysts estimated that a concentrated incendiary attack on a Japanese city could create similar conditions. LeMay ordered the first experimental raid for the night of March 9–10, 1945. The target: Tokyo's industrial districts on the city's eastern side. The weapon: M69 incendiary clusters, each containing 48 individual bomblets filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture developed specifically for this purpose. The force: 334 B-29s, stripped of most guns and gunners, each carrying 7 tons of incendiaries. The altitude: 5,000 to 8,000 feet. The timing: nighttime, to reduce fighter opposition. At 1700 hours on March 9th, the first B-29s began taking off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Flight crews had been briefed that this mission represented a test of new tactics. They had not been told that they would be flying into range of thousands of anti-aircraft guns without most of their defensive weapons. Some crews, discovering the missing guns during pre-flight inspection, reportedly questioned whether their aircraft had been properly equipped. The lead aircraft, piloted by Brigadier General Thomas Power, reached Tokyo at 0:15 hours on March 10th. The Pathfinder crews dropped their incendiaries in an X pattern across the target area, marking the boundaries for the main force following behind. What happened next was recorded by crew members, Japanese survivors, and reconnaissance aircraft in fragments that, assembled together, describe something beyond normal military operations. The initial bombs fell into neighborhoods where wooden houses stood wall to wall, separated by alleys barely wide enough for a single person. The M69 clusters broke apart at 2,000 feet, scattering their bomblets across roughly a quarter-acre each. The napalm inside burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite not just wood and paper, but the human body itself. Within 15 minutes, hundreds of individual fires had merged into dozens of larger conflagrations. Within 30 minutes, the larger fires had begun to merge into a single firestorm. A firestorm operates according to principles that are more thermodynamic than military. The intense heat creates a column of rising air that draws in oxygen from the surrounding area at ground level. This inrush of air becomes wind initially 15 to 20 miles per hour, then 40, then exceeding 60 miles per hour as the fire intensifies. The wind feeds more oxygen to the fire, which increases the heat, which strengthens the wind. The process becomes self-sustaining, and the fire begins to generate its own weather system. Bombardier Chester Marshall, flying in the fifth wave of bombers, later described looking down at Tokyo and seeing not a city, but a cauldron. The smoke column rose to 18,000 feet. We could see flames through it. The turbulence from the heat threw our aircraft around like it was a toy, and the smell you could smell, burning even at 7,000 feet with the oxygen masks on. By 0200 hours, approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo were burning. The temperature at ground level in some areas exceeded 1,800 degrees, hot enough to cause human spontaneous combustion without direct flame contact. People attempting to flee found themselves trapped by fire on multiple sides, with the wind forcing them backward. Thousands who jumped into the Sumida River to escape the heat died from steam burns when the water itself began to boil. Others suffocated in crowds at canal bridges where the press of bodies prevented movement in any direction. The B-29s continued bombing for nearly 3 hours. Crews in later waves reported that the smoke and turbulence made normal bombing runs impossible. Several aircraft dumped their loads from 10,000 feet just to get clear of the heat. At least 14 B-29s were damaged by turbulence or heat, though only 3 were lost, the lowest loss rate of any major raid on Japan to that point. When the fires finally died on the afternoon of March 10th, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the results. Approximately 16 square miles of the city no longer existed, not damaged, but completely incinerated. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey estimated that 84,000 people died that night, with another 41,000 injured. In comparison, the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki 5 months later killed approximately 70,000 people. The Tokyo raid of March 10, 1945, remains the single most destructive air attack in human history, measured by deaths in a 24-hour period. News of the raid reached Washington within 12 hours through military channels. The information that reached London came through different routes: intelligence summaries, diplomatic cables, and eventually detailed bomb damage assessment reports compiled from reconnaissance photography and Japanese radio intercepts. Churchill received his first briefing on the raid during the afternoon of March 11th, British time. What Churchill said in that moment, and in the days following, reveals the complexity of strategic thinking at the war's end stage. The remark about the final chapter of air warfare written in fire was recorded by Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, in his diary entry for March 13th. But Colville's complete entry provides important context. According to Colville, Churchill studied the reconnaissance photographs for several minutes before speaking. The photos showed what appeared to be a blank space where neighbourhoods had stood, not rubble, which would appear grey in aerial photography, but black ash. Churchill's immediate response, according to Colville, was to ask about the bomber losses. When told that only 3 aircraft had been lost from over 300 dispatched, Churchill reportedly said, "Then this is not merely destruction, it is obsolescence. Fighter, escort, defensive armament, daylight precision, all the doctrines we developed at such cost are now beside the point. The Americans have written the final chapter of air warfare, and it is written in fire." The statement reflected Churchill's recognition that strategic bombing had crossed a threshold. For nearly 5 years, British and American air forces had struggled with a fundamental tactical problem. Bombers operating in daylight suffered heavy losses to fighters, while bombers operating at night couldn't hit their targets with precision. The solution had been to develop long-range escort fighters for daylight raids and to accept area bombing for night raids. But the B-29, with its range, altitude capability, and ability to carry enormous bomb loads, had rendered this compromise obsolete. It could reach targets that no fighter could escort to, drop loads that no defensive fighter force could reasonably contest, and create destruction so complete that precision became irrelevant. But Churchill's response went beyond tactical assessment. In a minute to his chiefs of staff dated March 15th, Churchill wrote, "The attack on Tokyo demonstrates capabilities that raise questions about the post-war world. If bomber aircraft can now destroy cities without encountering meaningful resistance, the nature of deterrence changes fundamentally. The only defense against such attacks would be the threat of retaliation in kind, a prospect that should concern us all." This minute, preserved in the British National Archives, shows Churchill grasping the implications of strategic bombing's maturation. The B-29 raids on Japan were demonstrating that given sufficient resources, any major nation could now inflict catastrophic damage on any other major nation, regardless of distance or defensive preparations. The atomic bomb, still 4 months from its first use, would simply accelerate a transformation that was already underway. Churchill had additional reasons for concern. British strategic bombing doctrine, developed through 5 years of RAF operations over Germany, had always maintained a distinction, sometimes theoretical, sometimes genuine, between military targets and civilian areas. The distinction had eroded steadily as the war progressed, particularly during the area bombing campaign against German cities in 1943 and 1944. But the Tokyo raid eliminated even the pretense. The target area had been selected specifically because it contained dispersed military production, but the weapon incendiaries delivered in massive concentration made no distinction between workshop and dwelling. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Britain's Chief of Air Staff, met with Churchill on March 16th to discuss the implications. Portal's briefing notes, also preserved in the National Archives, indicate that he emphasised the operational efficiency of the attack. 100 tons of bombs per square mile destroyed, compared to 600 tons per square mile in the Hamburg raids of 1943. Portal noted that area incendiary attack against Japanese urban districts produces destruction ratios 5 to 6 times more efficient than high explosive attack against German cities, due to construction differences and fire susceptibility. Portal's clinical language captured the logic that governed strategic bombing by 1945. The campaign had become an industrial process, measured in tons per square mile and kill ratios, pursuing objectives defined in terms of economic capacity, destroyed rather than military targets eliminated. The Tokyo raid proved that this approach, applied with American industrial capacity and technological capability, could achieve results unprecedented in warfare. LeMay wasted no time exploiting the success. Between March 10th and March 19th, B-29s from the Marianas attacked Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe using similar tactics. The 4 raids combined destroyed approximately 32 square miles of Japanese urban area and killed an estimated 100,000 people, while losing only 22 bombers, a loss rate under 2%. On March 19th, LeMay received a cable from General Arnold in Washington. "Congratulations. This mission shows your crews have the right stuff." But the raids also generated concern among some American military and civilian leaders. Secretary of War Henry Stimson raised questions with President Roosevelt about the targeting policy, particularly whether incendiary area attacks violated international law regarding civilian protection. The discussion, such as it was, came to nothing. Roosevelt died on April 12th, and the succeeding administration under Truman faced more immediate questions about invasion, planning, and casualties. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan continued through the spring and summer of 1945. By July, B-29s had destroyed 66 Japanese cities, rendering approximately 40% of the urban area in Japan's largest cities uninhabitable. The attacks included innovation after innovation: mining of harbors to sever maritime supply routes, strikes against rail infrastructure to paralyze transportation, and finally, precision attacks against oil facilities that eliminated Japan's remaining fuel reserves. Yet the campaign's effectiveness remained debatable even as it unfolded. Japanese industrial production declined steadily through 1945, but whether this resulted primarily from bombing, from resource shortages caused by Allied naval blockade, or from the cumulative exhaustion of 4 years of total war, remained unclear. Japanese military resistance showed no signs of collapse. Kamikaze attacks intensified, and when American forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945, they encountered resistance that suggested Japanese ground forces retained both equipment and determination to continue fighting. Churchill followed these developments with increasing unease. In late May, he received intelligence reports indicating that American planners were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. Casualty estimates ranged from several 100,000 to over 1 million Allied casualties, depending on assumptions about Japanese resistance. The prospect horrified Churchill, who had watched British forces suffer 6 years of grinding attrition. He wrote to Truman on June 2nd, "If the bombing campaign cannot produce surrender without invasion, then we must ask what the bombing has accomplished beyond destruction." The question was more complicated than Churchill acknowledged. The bombing campaign had indeed failed to produce surrender through destruction alone, but it had accomplished something perhaps more significant. It had demonstrated that modern industrial warfare could destroy cities faster than they could be rebuilt, kill populations faster than they could be replaced, and disrupt economies faster than they could adapt. The B-29 raids over Japan in the spring and summer of 1945 were less a military campaign than a preview of total war's ultimate logic, that given sufficient capacity to project force, any adversary could be reduced to ash regardless of will to resist. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 are typically understood as the weapons that ended the war. But in terms of immediate destruction, neither attack exceeded the toll of the March 10th Tokyo raid. Hiroshima killed approximately 70,000 people initially. Nagasaki killed approximately 70,000. The Tokyo raid killed 84,000 in a single night using conventional weapons. What made the atomic bombs psychologically decisive was not the scale of destruction, which was already familiar, but the efficiency. A single B-29 carrying a single bomb could now accomplish what had previously required 300 B-29s carrying 2,000 bombs. Churchill grasped this point immediately upon learning of the Hiroshima attack. His response, recorded in multiple sources, focused not on the bomb itself, but on its implications for the strategic bombing doctrine he had helped develop. In a conversation with his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, on August 7th, Churchill reportedly said, "We spent 5 years learning how to destroy cities with bombers. The Americans have now rendered everything we learned obsolete. This weapon changes nothing about the morality of aerial bombardment, but it changes everything about its practicality." The comment reveals Churchill's understanding that the atomic bomb represented acceleration rather than transformation. The B-29 raids on Japan had already demonstrated that strategic bombing could destroy cities completely. The atomic bomb simply made it faster and cheaper. The real transformation had occurred months earlier, over Tokyo, when American bombers had proven they could operate at will over an enemy homeland, delivering destruction on a scale that exceeded any previous weapon system. This recognition shaped Churchill's thinking about the post-war world. In conversations with Stalin and Truman at Potsdam in July 1945, Churchill raised the issue of international controls on strategic bombing. The discussions went nowhere. All three powers possessed the capability. None wanted to surrender it, and the question of enforcement proved intractable. But Churchill's concern was prescient. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union would have its own atomic weapons and long-range bombers. Within 15 years, both superpowers would possess missiles that made even the question of bomber vulnerability irrelevant. The B-29 itself had a relatively short operational life as a strategic bomber. The last combat missions occurred in Korea in 1953, barely 8 years after the Tokyo raids. By then, jet-powered B-47s were entering service, capable of flying higher, faster, and farther. The B-29's tactical innovations, low-altitude night attacks, area incendiary bombing, acceptance of massive civilian casualties became doctrinal standards that would be applied repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf. But the aircraft's real legacy lay not in tactics or technology, but in what it demonstrated about industrial warfare's trajectory. The B-29 represented the culmination of a 30-year evolution in strategic bombing theory, from the fragile biplanes of the First World War to machines capable of flying 1,500 miles, dropping 7 tons of ordnance and returning home without refueling. That evolution had begun with theorists like Julio Douhet and Billy Mitchell arguing that air power could win wars by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity. It ended with Curtis LeMay proving that air power could destroy industrial capacity, urban infrastructure, and entire populations, but that destruction alone might not be sufficient to compel surrender without complementary military operations. The March 10th raid on Tokyo killed more people in 6 hours than died in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. This fact, often overlooked in popular understanding of the war, reveals something important about how technological capability intersects with strategic results. The atomic bomb's psychological impact derived not from producing unprecedented destruction, but from producing familiar destruction through unprecedented means. By August 1945, Japanese leaders had already witnessed 66 cities destroyed by conventional bombing. What shocked them about Hiroshima was the realization that this destruction could now be delivered by a single aircraft carrying a single weapon, meaning that no amount of fighter defense or anti-aircraft preparation could provide meaningful protection. Churchill understood this distinction. In his post-war memoir, The Second World War, published in 6 volumes between 1948 and 1954, Churchill devoted considerable space to the strategic bombing campaign's evolution. his treatment of the Tokyo raids is notably somber. He described them as demonstrating the terrible effectiveness of modern air power when applied without restraint against urban targets, and noted that the ease with which American bombers ranged over Japan in the war's final months raised questions about warfare's future that haunted those of us who had advocated for strategic bombing as a means to shorten the war. That haunted quality pervaded much discussion of strategic bombing in the immediate post-war years. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which examined bombing effectiveness in both Europe and the Pacific, concluded that strategic bombing had been less decisive than its advocates claimed. Japanese industrial production declined through 1945, but continued operating even under intense attack. Japanese military resistance remained formidable until the atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war created a political shock that conventional bombing, no matter how destructive, had failed to produce. Yet the survey also noted that strategic bombing's impact on morale and social cohesion was difficult to measure, but potentially significant. The firebombing campaign had rendered millions homeless, disrupted food distribution, destroyed medical facilities, and created refugee flows that overwhelmed Japanese civil administration. Whether these effects contributed meaningfully to Japan's surrender remained arguable, but they demonstrated that modern air power could systematically dismantle a society's functional capacity, even when it could not directly compel military surrender. This paradox that strategic bombing could produce unprecedented physical destruction without necessarily achieving strategic decision would trouble military planners for decades. It suggested that in modern industrial warfare, the relationship between destructive capacity and political outcome was complex and possibly non-linear. Simply increasing the amount of destruction inflicted might not proportionally increase the pressure for surrender, particularly when the target population and leadership maintained ideological commitment or feared the consequences of defeat more than the consequences of continued resistance. Churchill, reflecting on these issues in his later years, reportedly expressed ambivalence about the role strategic bombing had played in Allied victory. In a conversation with his physician Lord Moran in 1953, recorded in Moran's diaries, Churchill said, "We believed that bombing German cities would break their will to fight. It did not. The Americans believed that bombing Japanese cities would break their will to fight. It did not. What broke them was the shock of the atomic bomb and the Soviet invasion political events, not the destruction itself. We killed hundreds of thousands to learn what perhaps we should have understood from the start, that people do not surrender because their cities are destroyed. They surrender when they conclude that continuing to fight serves no purpose. This retrospective judgment may have been too harsh. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, whatever its moral implications, did achieve significant military results. Japanese industrial production declined by approximately 40% between March and August 1945. Transportation networks collapsed under the combined weight of bombing and naval blockade. Resources that might have been devoted to military production were instead consumed by civil defense, firefighting, and refugee support. And while bombing alone did not compel surrender, it created conditions, economic disruption, social exhaustion, leadership isolation that made surrender more conceivable when the atomic bombs provided a face-saving rationale for accepting defeat. But Churchill's fundamental point remained valid. The relationship between destructive capability and strategic outcome was less straightforward than bombing advocates had predicted. The B-29 demonstrated that modern nations possessed the technical capacity to destroy other modern nations' cities systematically and efficiently. What remained unclear was whether possessing this capacity produced strategic advantage proportional to its moral cost and resource investment. These questions became increasingly urgent as the Cold War developed. By 1950, both the United States and Soviet Union possessed atomic weapons and the bombers to deliver them. By the late 1950s, both possessed hydrogen bombs hundreds of times more powerful than the weapons used on Japan. The logic of deterrence that Churchill had identified in his March 1945 minute to the Chiefs of Staff, that the only defense against strategic bombing was the threat of retaliation in kind, became the organizing principle of international security. The B-29 raids over Japan in 1945 represented a historical inflection point. They demonstrated that the long-theorized potential of strategic bombing to destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war through air attack on industrial and urban targets was technically achievable. They also demonstrated that achieving this capability required industrial resources, technological sophistication, and operational scale beyond what most nations could muster. And they suggested, though did not definitively prove, that even when achieved, strategic bombing's decisive effect remained dependent on factors beyond simple destruction. Churchill's comment about the final chapter of air warfare written in fire captured this moment's significance. The chapter was indeed final in the sense that it marked the completion of a technological and doctrinal evolution that had begun in the First World War. But it was also a beginning, the opening of an era in which the capacity for mutual destruction would define great power relations, and in which the moral and practical questions raised by strategic bombing would persist without resolution. The crew members who flew those missions over Japan rarely discussed what they had witnessed. Many lived with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, though that term and the understanding behind it would not emerge for decades. Chester Marshall, the bombardier who described Tokyo as a cauldron, returned to civilian life in Ohio and worked as an insurance agent until his death in 1987. He gave only one interview about his war experiences, in 1979, in which he said, "We did what we were ordered to do, and we believed it was necessary to win the war and save American lives, but I've thought about it every day since. The mathematics of it, trading their deaths for ours, seemed clear at the time. Now I'm not sure what we proved except that we could do it. That uncertainty about what was proven, what was achieved, and whether the achievement justified the cost extended to Churchill himself. In his final years, Churchill returned repeatedly to questions about strategic bombing's role in the war. He never condemned it. He had been too deeply involved in its development and execution for simple condemnation. But neither did he celebrate it. His most considered judgment appeared in the final volume of his war memoirs, published in 1954, where he wrote, "History will judge the bombing campaigns according to whether they shortened the war and saved lives overall. That judgment must weigh not only the immediate casualties, but the precedent established for future conflicts. If the legacy of strategic bombing is a world where cities can be destroyed in hours, then we have purchased victory at a price whose full cost may not be known for generations." Those words, written 9 years after the Tokyo raids and as the Cold War's nuclear arms race accelerated, showed Churchill grasping that the B-29's significance extended beyond World War II's specific context. The aircraft had proven that modern industrial nations possessed the technical capacity to inflict destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Whether they possessed the wisdom to constrain that capacity, or whether the logic of deterrence and mutual vulnerability would contain what direct restraint could not, remained the central question of the emerging nuclear age. The 12,000 tons that Churchill referenced in his initial response, a figure that encompassed not just the March 10th raid, but the entire spring campaign, represented a threshold crossed. It was the weight of a new kind of warfare, industrial in scale and apocalyptic in effect, where victory measured not in territory gained or armies defeated, but in capacity destroyed and populations displaced. The B-29 made that warfare possible. The atomic bomb made it instantaneous. But the moral questions, both raised about proportionality, necessity, and the relationship between means and ends in war, remained unresolved then and remain unresolved now. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.